The patrol car smelled faintly of stale coffee and desperation, a scent Detective Elias Thorne had grown intimately familiar with over 12 years on the force. Thorne wasn't your classic, stoic movie cop. He was a man carved from regret, wearing a perpetually tired expression that seemed to mirror the gray winter sky above the city of Blackwood. IT was 3 a.m. when a call came in, a 10 to 55 suspicious person. That quickly escalated to a 10 to 54 homicide at the old Silas House, a sprawling, dilapidated Victorian sitting on the edge of the abandoned railway yard. Thorne's partner, Officer Kira Jenkins, a sharp-witted woman 3 years out of the academy, drove in silence, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. "Silas House," Jenkins murmured, breaking the quiet. "They say it's been empty since the 40s, since the whole family disappeared. Locals call it the No Echo House." "Superstition, Jenkins," Thorne grunted, adjusting his tie. "It's old and insulated. Sound gets trapped." But when they arrived, the air was thick with stillness that felt unnatural. 2 uniformed officers were huddled near the front porch, their flashlights cutting hesitant beams through the pre-dawn mist. The front door was slightly ajar, revealing a black void inside. "Thorne," said one of the uniforms, Officer Reyes, his voice tight. We found him in the parlor. No forced entry. And Detective, the house, it's too quiet." Thorne pushed past them. The interior of the Silas House was a museum of decay. Dust motes danced in the sparse light. He followed the trail of red crime scene tape into the parlor. The victim, a man in his late 50s identified as Arthur Finch, a known private investigator, was seated at a grand, dust-covered mahogany table. He looked entirely undisturbed, his hands resting neatly on his lap, but his eyes were wide open, locked in an expression of pure, soul-shattering terror. Staring at something Thorne couldn't see, the cause of death was instantly apparent. A single, deep incision running horizontally across his throat. Clean, surgical. There was almost no blood splatter on the surrounding furniture. The pool of blood on the floor seemed to have been confined, collected. Jenkins gasped slightly, pointing to the table. Lying next to Finch's hand was a small, antique music box. Thorne approached the body, his flashlight beams sweeping the walls. The parlor was vast, high-ceilinged. Thorne clapped his hands. A sharp, percussive sound, and then the true horror of the Silas House revealed itself. The clap made no sound. Not a dampening, not a muffling. The sound simply ceased to exist the moment it left his hands. It was a visual confirmation of an action, but the expected auditory feedback was absent. Thorne tried again, louder this time. Nothing. It felt like shouting underwater. Jenkins, her face pale, whispered, "The No Echo House." "It's not an echo, Jenkins," Thorne said, his voice a strained croak that he could barely hear himself speak. "It's a complete absorption of sound. It's a localized acoustic vacuum." He focused his flashlight back on the victim. Finch's mouth was slightly open, his lips parted. Thorne leaned closer, and that's when he saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible sliver of paper tucked between a man's front teeth. Using a pair of sterilized tweezers from his kit, Thorne carefully extracted the paper. It was a fragment of photograph, brittle and yellowed. On it, only one thing was clearly visible: a pair of dark, empty eyes, utterly devoid of reflection, staring out from the crumbling photograph. The most unnerving detail, the chilling hook that secured the entire scene, was a message scribbled in tiny, elegant script across the back of the photo fragment. "I heard you coming." Thorne looked around the perfectly silent, sound-devouring room, his heart hammering a frantic, unheard rhythm against his ribs. How could man, sitting in a room that swallowed sound, possibly be killed without a struggle and leave behind a note suggesting the killer knew they were? Approaching, this wasn't a crime scene. It was a stage. And the audience, the victim and now the police, were trapped inside a soundproof, terrifying box. The silence of the parlor was oppressive, clinging to the skin like cold, wet silk. Thorne pocketed the photo fragment, his mind already racing. If the killer had indeed managed to neutralize the sound in the room, they possessed a terrifying level of control. "Jenkins, get the Emmy in here fast, and tell them to bring specialized acoustic gear. Nothing standard. And keep the perimeter tight. No one touches anything, especially not that music box," Thorne ordered, his own voice sounding distant and thin in his ears. Jenkins nodded, moving towards the door. As she stepped out, the overwhelming silence eased just slightly, a faint hum of city life leaking back in, proving the anomaly was localized to the parlor. Thorne knelt by the victim, Arthur Finch. Finch was an experienced PI, meaning he wasn't careless. He must have been investigating something deeply unsettling to end up here. Thorne ran a gloved finger along the clean incision on Finch's throat. It was the work of someone precise, possibly trained. But what troubled him more was the look on Finch's face. It wasn't pain. It was pure, anticipatory dread. As if he had seen his doom approach but was physically incapable of reacting, he then turned his attention to the antique music box. It was a beautiful piece, carved from dark cherry wood. Clearly expensive. Thorne carefully lifted the lid with a sterile instrument, ready for the sharp, mechanical tinkle of a classic tune. Instead, a series of 5 distinct, rapid clicks emanated from the tiny mechanism before it went silent. No melody, no cheerful tune. Just 5 mechanical clicks. Thorne frowned. He opened the box fully and used his penlight to examine the rotating cylinder. Most of the pins were missing or filed down. Only 5 were left, spaced unevenly. A code, he muttered. Not music. He stood up and began a meticulous sweep of the parlor, ignoring the growing discomfort caused by the lack of auditory feedback. He examined the dusty bookshelves lining one wall. They were filled with ancient, unread tomes, their spines crumbling on one shelf. Behind a heavy, leather-bound book on classical architecture, Thorne found a small depression in the dust, the only disturbance other than the victim and the police activity. He reached into the void. His fingers closed around something cold and metallic. He pulled it out. A cassette tape, the kind used in old micro-recorders, labeled simply SH. A rush of cold air seemed to sweep through the room, even though the windows were sealed shut. Just then, Jenkins returned, her face a mass of concern. Detective, the Emmy is en route, but something happened outside. Officer Reyes went back to the patrol car to grab the evidence kit. He swore he heard his name called out, clear as a bell, from inside the house after he stepped out. Thorne held up the cassette tape. Did he come back in? No, sir, but he looked in through the door. The parlor was exactly as we left it. But he said, just before he closed the door, he thought he saw something move across the far wall. What did he see? Jenkins swallowed hard. A shadow, detective. Not a person's shadow. A shadow that didn't match anything in the room. He said it looked like the shadow of a piece of string tightening. Thorne stared at the grand table where Finch sat, motionless. The message on the photo, I heard you coming, combined with the strange acoustic anomaly and the sighting of an impossible shadow, painted a picture far beyond a simple homicide. He looked down at the cassette tape, Sage, in his hand, then at the unnerving, code-like music box. Whatever Finch was investigating, it had a sound signature, and perhaps a recording of it. Jenkins, Thorne said, his voice dropping to a near-inaudible whisper. We're going to play this tape. But first, we need to get out of this room. I don't like being in the killer's echo chamber. As they began to retreat, Thorne glanced one last time at the ceiling. High up in the dark plaster, he noticed a faint, circular watermark, almost invisible beneath the grime. It was perfectly centered above Finch's chair. IT was the size of a small microphone. Thorne and Jenkins established a temporary command post in one of the patrol cars, the comforting crackle of the police radio a welcome counterpoint to the silence they had just escaped. The medical examiner's van arrived, followed by a CSI unit equipped with specialized noise mapping technology, but Thorne held them at bay. He needed to understand the cassette first. Using an old, handheld microcassette player from the car's evidence kit, Thorne inserted the tape labeled S.H. Jenkins leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the tiny speakers. He pressed play. For a moment, there was only static, the familiar hiss of cheap tape. Then a low-frequency hum began, a sound so deep it was felt more than heard, resonating unpleasantly in their chests. The hum was interspersed with snippets of recorded dialogue. They need absolute zero, acoustic zero. That's the only way to shield the frequency. Not safe to keep it here. Not with the resonance the pattern repeats every. The voices were faint, distorted, and academic. Finch had clearly been recording experts discussing some obscure, theoretical concept. Thorne hit pause, his brow furrowed. Acoustic 0? Shielding a frequency. Jenkins repeated, baffled. This sounds like fringe science, Detective. Thorne rewound the tape, focusing on the 5-click pattern from the music box. He replayed the tape, listening intently for any mention of numbers, intervals, or rhythmic structures. He played the tape a third time. Just as the low hum peaked, one of the voices became clearer, calmer, almost lecturing. The pattern is based on a primal metric, a sequence used to mark the end of an interval, not the beginning. It's always 5 points, the 5 stops, to define the temporal boundary. Thorne's eyes snapped to the music box, still sitting on the passenger seat. Its cherry was dark and inert. 5 clicks, 5 stops. Jenkins, the Silas family, Thorne said, pointing to the house. Why did the locals call it the No Echo House even before this? It's too specific for just an old house. I pulled a preliminary search on the way here, Jenkins replied, flipping through her notes. The patriarch, Dr. Alastair Silas, was a physicist who worked on experimental sound and wave mechanics at the nearby university in the 1930s. He disappeared along with his wife and 3 children in 1941. Thorne leaned back, the pieces clicking into place. A physicist obsessed with sound, a house built to absorb sound, a PI investigating an acoustic 0, and a murder committed in perfect, terrifying silence. Dr. Silas didn't just build a house. Jenkins. He built a device, Thorne theorized. The parlor is a chamber. The circular watermark on the ceiling was a microphone or maybe a transducer. He created a space where sound waves are actively canceled, a perfect acoustic void. But why? And how does that connect to Finch's death? Jenkins asked. Thorne picked up the music box, his gloved fingers tracing the carvings. The note said, I heard you coming. In a silent room, the only thing the killer could hear was the victim's own body. The subtle shifts in clothing, the faint scrape of leather on wood, the amplified, internalized sound of his own fear. He looked at the music box again. The 5 clicks aren't a code to the killer, Jenkins. They are a code from the victim, or perhaps a timer. What if Finch knew he was in danger and tried to send a final signal? Thorne suddenly felt a cold knot of realization tighten in his gut. The 5 clicks, the 5 people who vanished from this house in 1941, Silas, his wife, and their 3 children. 5 stops, 5 temporal boundaries. He snatched the phone and called the CSI lead, his voice urgent. Listen to me before you enter the parlor. Check the floor under the table. Look for any disturbance. I mean microscopic. And check the ventilation ducts for any sealed compartments. I think Finch was sitting on top of something, and the killer took it. A minute later, the CSI officer's voice came back, strained and bewildered. Detective Thorne, we found it. A small section of the floor beneath the victim's chair was recently cut and replaced. A micro-recording device seems to have been hastily removed. But we found something else, sir, taped to the underside of the chair. What is it? Thorne demanded. It's a diagram, Detective. Looks like a schematic for a sonic oscillator. And underneath the diagram, written in the victim's handwriting, are 3 words. Thorne waited, the chilling implications and acoustic weapon washing over him. He wrote, the stretched string. The phrase, the stretched string, resonated with a cold, unsettling finality. Thorne immediately recalled Officer Reyes' description. A shadow that looked like a piece of string, tightening, moving across the wall. It was a visual manifestation tied to the victim's final thought. A stretched string vibrates and produces sound, Jenkins, Thorne mused, his mind grappling with the physics of the crime. In a room designed to devour sound, the string wouldn't just vibrate. It would be the only thing producing an acoustic signal, a highly concentrated, localized frequency. He quickly consulted the schematic found taped under Finch's chair. It was indeed a diagram for a specialized sonic oscillator, detailed in Finch's hasty notes. The device was designed not to produce audible sound, but a targeted low-frequency pulse, possibly at the extreme edge of human hearing, an infrasound weapon. Infrasound can cause intense emotional and physical distress, disorientation, panic, even rupturing organs if powerful enough, Jenkins stated, recalling her academy training. If the killer used this, it would explain the sheer terror on Finch's face, even if he couldn't hear the attack. And the killer didn't need to hear it either. Thorne added grimly, they could have worn specialized dampeners, or simply known the precise frequency to use, and avoided it. The string shadow Reyes saw was likely the visual distortion caused by the weapon's frequency pulse hitting the dust motes and walls, making the air vibrate in a visible pattern. Thorne picked up the phone and contacted Detective Sergeant Walsh at the precinct. He ordered a deep dive into the historical records of Dr. Alistair Silas in the No Echo House, focusing on his research associates, funding sources, and any records of strange equipment purchases in the late 1930s. And Walsh, Thorne added, prioritized anyone Finch was investigating, specifically anyone connected to the namesage and acoustic research. While waiting for the data, Thorne and Jenkins reviewed the stolen microrecorder's cavity. The CSI team had found trace fibers of fine, dark silk and a minute residue of copper oxide, suggesting the removed device was highly sophisticated and shielded. Jenkins then pointed to a detail on the music box. Detective, I found an inscription on the bottom plate, hidden under the velvet lining. It was a faded Latin phrase, delicately carved. Silentium loquitur. Silence speaks. Thorne translated quietly. The killer is sending a message with his silence, a perverse signature. Just then, Sergeant Walsh called back, his voice tight with alarm. Thorne, the P.I., Finch, he wasn't looking for a person. He was looking for an organization. Walsh reported. Arthur Finch was retained by a shell corporation named Echo Bane Solutions. We traced him back to a defunct university department that Dr. Silas used a chair. Walsh continued, his voice dropping. And the name as it's on the cassette? We found a record. It belongs to a man named Sebastian Hayes. He was Silas's prize student. Disappeared shortly after the Silas family in 41. The official report said he died in a chemical accident, but the records are spotty. Sebastian Hayes. Thorne repeated the name. He would be close to 100 years old if he were still alive. Unlikely, but his research or his legacy is certainly alive and killing. Walsh then hit them with the chilling revelation. Hayes didn't just study infrasound, Thorne. The records indicate he was working on something he called temporal harmonics, the idea that the human brain could be made to process sound at a slight delay, creating a kind of acoustic paralysis before the real sound even reached the ears. Thorne gripped the steering wheel, remembering Finch's look of anticipatory horror. Acoustic paralysis. The victim knew what was coming, but his brain couldn't process the physical action until it was too late. Walsh, search Hayes' personal records, diaries, notebooks, anything that mentions a location other than the Silas House, or any connection to a highly tuned metal, Thorne commanded. The stretched string is our next lead. As he hung up, Jenkins pointed out the window. A sliver of copper-colored light was finally beginning to pierce the dark Blackwood sky. Detective, Jenkins said slowly, pointing toward the railway yard adjacent to the house. Dr. Silas's research used to be funded by the Blackwood Rail conglomerate for experimental signaling. The trains run right behind this house. Thorne followed her gaze. In the distance, rising above the derelict sheds of the rail yard, was a newly constructed, windowless metal tower, glinting copper in the morning light. It hadn't been there a year ago. It was too tall, too isolated, and seemed to hum faintly even from this distance. That's not a signal tower, Jenkins, Thorne whispered. That's a transmission point. If the Silas House was the acoustic chamber, that tower is a power source of the stretched string. And if Sebastian Hayes is our killer, or the key to this, he's broadcasting something. Thorne and Jenkins drove towards the copper tower, the air growing colder and denser as they approached the abandoned railway yard. The tower, a slender, brutalist structure, was secured by a new chain-link fence topped with razor wire. There were no surveillance cameras, no warning signs, just an unnerving, palpable silence surrounding it. Even though they were hundreds of yards from the No Echo House, Walsh just sent a file on Sebastian Hayes, Jenkins announced, reading from her tablet. His death report was fabricated. The records show he took a leave of absence right after the Silas family disappeared, traveled overseas, and then worked under several aliases for decades, always in the field of wave mechanics or acoustic engineering. He didn't die. He vanished to continue the work, Thorne concluded, staring at the tower. Hayes is likely still alive, or he spent his life building this network. He would be in his late 90s. But the level of precision we saw on Finch suggests either a younger apprentice or a killer who is fanatically meticulous. The file included a digitized page from Hayes' personal notebook. Thorne recognized the meticulous script immediately. It matched the note on the back of Finch's photo fragment. I heard you coming. The notebook entry was a theoretical manifesto. The brain is susceptible to acoustic trickery by delaying perception of an immediate threat through a precise, low-frequency pulse, the temporal harmonic. We can induce a psychological state of absolute dread. The victim perceives the inevitable outcome before they hear the action. They are murdered by the sound of their own incoming doom. The body freezes. The mind anticipates the end. A perfect, silent execution. The stretched string is the medium. Thorne's blood ran cold. This wasn't just murder. It was psychological torture taken to its absolute extreme. The killer wasn't silencing the victim's scream. They were paralyzing the ability to scream by hijacking the victim's auditory processing. He's experimenting, Jenkins, Thorne stated, pulling the car to a stop near the main gate. Finch was killed to send a message, and the no-echo house was a controlled environment. The copper tower is where he broadcast the temporal harmonic. They climbed the fence, Jenkins handling the razor wire with practiced ease. The tower's base was a windowless concrete bunker. The only entry was a heavy, reinforced steel door with a sophisticated electronic keypad. No way we're kicking this down. Thorne sighed. Walsh! Check Hayes' data again. Any mention of a common security code, a key phrase, or a significant date. Moments later, Walsh's voice crackled through the comms. Thorne, we found it. In the margins of the Temple Harmonics Manifesto, there was a date circled, 05041941 May 4th, 1941. The last day anyone saw the Silas family alive. Jenkins immediately punched the 8 digits into the keypad. 05041941 and a heavy clunk echoed from the mechanism, and the steel door hissed open, revealing a dark, concrete staircase winding down into the earth. The air that rushed out was sterile and smelled faintly of ozone and hot metal. Stay sharp, Jenkins. If the killer is down there, they know we're inside their sanctuary now, Thorne warned. Draw his weapon. They descended into a subterranean labyrinth. The walls hummed slightly, and the floor vibrated with a faint, steady pulse. The infrasound broadcast. The staircase ended in a vast, circular chamber dominated by a complex apparatus of copper wiring, vacuum tubes, and gigantic, polished metal resonators. In the center, connected to the console, was a microphone stand holding an unusual transducer wrapped in fine, dark silk, the same silk found at the crime scene, and standing at the console, backlit by the strange, pulsing energy of the machinery, was an old man. He was shockingly frail, his skin thin and translucent, but his eyes, sharp and intensely focused, were unnervingly familiar. They were the empty eyes on the fragment of the photo found with Finch and he. Turned slowly, a faint, condescending smile stretching his thin lips. Detective Thorne, I presume, the old man rasped, his voice a dry, cultivated whisper that seemed to cut through the humming air. I knew you were coming. I could hear your intent long before your car arrived. He lifted his hands. In his left, he held a tiny micro-recorder, identical to the one stolen from Finch. In his right, he held a small, perfectly taut copper wire, the stretched string. The temporal harmonic is active. Sebastian, Hayes said, his smile widening into a sinister grin. Welcome to the 0 point. Let's see if you can hear the sound of your own death, detective. He flicked the taut copper wire. It made a soundless, visual snap as the temporal harmonic intensified. The soundless snap of the taut copper wire triggered an immediate, sickening pressure in Thorne's skull. It wasn't pain, but a deep, overwhelming disorientation, as if his inner ear had suddenly been inverted. The low-frequency hum of the massive resonator intensified, vibrating the very air around them. The temporal harmonic works by creating a cognitive lag. Hayes explained, his voice sounding simultaneously close and miles away. Your brain is processing reality microseconds behind what your eyes see. Your fear is arriving before the threat. Thorne felt a primal surge of panic, his instincts screaming for him to move. Yet his body felt sluggish, trapped in a viscous current of delayed reaction. He raised his service weapon, but the movement felt slow, wrong, like watching a poorly dubbed film. Jenkins, positioned slightly behind Thorne, gasped and clutched her head. "Detective, I can't think straight." Hayes laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Excellent. The harmonic is reaching maximum resonance. You're experiencing the acoustic signature of your own demise." That private investigator, Finch, he sat in that chair and watched his life end in slow motion, frozen by the soundless dread of the stretched string. Thorne fought through the sensory fog. He knew he couldn't fire his weapon accurately in this state. He had to disrupt the broadcast. His eyes darted to the large, custom-built microphone on the stand, the transducer wrapped in the fine silk. "You kidnapped the Silas family to finish your work," Thorne yelled, hoping the sheer force of his own voice would cut through the delay. Even though the words felt heavy and labored, leaving his mouth, Hayes' eyes narrowed, his frail composure cracking slightly. "They weren't kidnapped, Detective. They became the first subjects of the temporal harmonic. Dr. Silas lacked the ruthlessness to test it to its full potential. I had to ensure the purity of the research, the 0 point of acoustic control." As Hayes spoke, he raised a micro-recorder in his left hand, aiming it towards Thorne. "Now, I will record the perfect silence of a police officer's fear." Thorne saw the small, red rec light flicker on the recorder. He knew he had seconds before Hayes escalated the infrasound pulse into a lethal frequency. Ignoring the agonizing delay between his intent and his action, Thorne threw his heavy flashlight directly at the console. The flashlight didn't hit the console. It struck the thin microphone stand with a sharp, metallic clang, and suddenly, the deep, gut-wrenching hum of the temporal harmonic shattered. The chamber filled with the deafening sound of an unshielded, high-decibel squeal, an acute, piercing feedback loop caused by the disrupted transducer hitting the sensitive resonators. Hayes screamed, clutching his ears. The sound was so intense it was physically painful, the perfect opposite of the silence he craved. The shock broke the acoustic paralysis instantly. Jenkins seized the opportunity. Though still dizzy, she sprinted past Thorne, kicking the main power cable connecting the console to the resonators. Sparks flew, and the room went dark, plunging them into oppressive blackness, broken only by Thorne's tactical light. When Thorne's flashlight beam found the console, Hayes was slumped over complex wiring, motionless. The copper wire, the stretched string, had fallen from his hand and lay inert on the concrete floor. Thorne rushed forward, checking Hayes' pulse. Nothing. The shock wave of the feedback had been too much for his frail, elderly body. "It's over," Jenkins whispered, her breathing ragged. But as they secured the scene, Thorne noticed the micro-recorder that Hayes had been holding. It had rolled beneath the console. He retrieved it, noticing the red rec light was still faintly glowing. Hayes had activated the recording. Thorne pressed the stop button and then play, expecting to hear the chaotic squeal of the feedback loop. Instead, the tiny speaker played only one sound, clear and chillingly distinct, even over the ringing in their ears, the 5. Mechanical, rapid clicks of the music box. Hayes hadn't been recording their fear in that final moment. He had been recording a preset signal, a temporal boundary. The same 5 clicks that marked the end of the Silas family. Thorne looked around the dark, massive chamber. Hayes was dead, but the mechanism remained. The temporal harmonic was off, but the infrastructure was still here. "He wasn't recording us, Jenkins," Thorne said, a cold dread creeping back. "He was recording the stops, the signal to end the current broadcast and begin the next phase. This wasn't the final experiment." He pointed his light at the massive copper resonators lining the wall. One of them had a small, recently added digital screen, now displaying a simple, pulsing message. Phase 2 activation, 12 hours. The stretched string was now loose, but the music box clicks had started a terrifying countdown. Thorne stared at the digital display. Phase 2 activation, 12 hours. The countdown was an unnerving post-mortem challenge. Hayes was dead, but his work was prepared to evolve. Triggered by the last sound he ever recorded, the 5 clicks, the temporal boundary. Hayes wasn't working alone or he left an elaborate, automated contingency. Thorne assessed, stepping back from the console. We have to assume Phase 2 is a broad application of the temporal harmonic, possibly targeting a larger area than just the no-echo house and this bunker. Jenkins immediately called the precinct, directing a full tactical and engineering team to their location, emphasizing the immediate danger posed by the sonic device. She also ordered all available personnel to begin evacuating the immediate vicinity of the railway yard and the Blackwood residential area as they waited for backup. Thorne went through Hayes' notes scattered around the console. They weren't just scientific scribbles. They were fanatical manifestos about acoustic purification and eliminating the cacophony of modern life. One section, heavily underlined, mentioned a specific location. The harmonic must reach the source of the initial resonance, the great steel conduit, the ancient drum that pounds the city's pulse. Only then can the stretched string truly sing. The great steel conduit, Thorne murmured, tracing the words. The railway. This complex is attached to the Blackwood rail line. Jenkins, pull up the schematics for the Blackwood rail conglomerate. Hayes mentioned the ancient drum that pounds the city's pulse. That sounds like a central hub, maybe a major switching yard, or a maintenance facility. Jenkins brought up the map. The largest, oldest, and most acoustically resonant structure on the Blackwood rail line was the Iron Gate Maintenance Depot, located centrally in the city, an enormous, hangar-like building filled with massive rolling stock and miles of track. It's close to the city center, Detective. If Phase 2 activates there, the infrasound could sweep across half of Blackwood, Jenkins reported, her voice tight with fear. Thorne focused on the physical mechanism of the Phase 2 countdown. He located a small, locked metal safe embedded in the concrete floor beneath Hayes' chair. This had to contain the key to disabling the system, or at least understanding the transmission specifics. Using a lock-picking kit from the evidence bag, Thorne worked methodically. Just as the tumblers clicked into place, the entire bunker shuddered violently. What was that? Jenkins cried, looking up at the reinforced ceiling. Thorne pulled open the safe. Inside lay two things, a single key intricately cast and a small, perfectly polished brass tuning fork. The safe's door contained a tiny, pressure-sensitive mechanism. Opening the safe had triggered the tremor on the tuning fork. Etched with the same elegant script as the note was one word: source. Thorne pocketed the key and the tuning fork. Hayes didn't build a bomb, Jenkins. He built a tuning system. The tremor was a sonic calibration, an early signal transmitted to the source location. He looked back at the console, noticing a faint green light, now blinking beneath the power switch. Jenkins, the system isn't off. It's in standby. And that key, I think it belongs to whatever Hayes hid at the Iron Gate Depot. It's the final piece of the stretched string. As the tactical unit began to breach the steel door above them, Thorne and Jenkins prepared to leave the 0 point. Before exiting, Thorne glanced back at Sebastian Hayes' body, his face still twisted in silent agony. He noticed a faint red mark on the old man's forearm, hidden by his sleeve, a small, circular incision, like a biopsy. Thorne used his camera to take a detailed photo. The incision was fresh, healing, and disturbingly neat. It suggested Hayes himself may have been subject to the harmonics testing, or perhaps someone else had harvested something from his body. Hayes was a tool too, Thorne concluded grimly. Someone was observing this experiment, possibly collecting biological data. We need to get to the Iron Gate Depot before that counter hits 0, and before whoever is pulling the strings decides to collect our data. Thorne and Jenkins emerged from the subterranean bunker and were immediately enveloped by the frantic activity of the arriving tactical and engineering teams. Thorne quickly briefed Sergeant Walsh on the 12-hour countdown and the location of Phase 2 activation, the Iron Gate Maintenance Depot. Walsh, get forensic pathology on Hayes' body immediately. Focus on that incision on his forearm. I want to know exactly what was extracted, Thorne commanded, his voice sharp with urgency. We're heading to the depot now. That location is the source Hayes mentioned. Their drive to the Iron Gate Depot was a blur of flashing lights and desperate planning. Jenkins pulled up missing person reports from the Blackwood area over the last year, focusing on individuals with obscure links to acoustic research or those who vanished without a trace, Much like Finch, before they reached the depot, the forensic pathology report on Sebastian Hayes' body arrived. Thorne, the incision was for the extraction of a tiny biocompatible monitoring chip. Walsh reported over the radio, his voice grave. It's advanced telemetry, not for biological sampling. Hayes wasn't just the architect. He was a carefully observed subject. Monitored by whom? Thorne muttered, gripping the brass tuning fork, the source key, in his hand. That's the question. But the chip contained a broadcast history, Thorne. It shows that over the last year, the device at the Silas House was activated 5 times, each on the first day of a month. 5 stops, just like the music box. Thorne felt a cold wave of realization. Finch was only the 5th victim. The others were tests perfecting the temporal harmonic. They arrived at the Iron Gate Maintenance Depot. It was a cathedral of steel, a vast, echoing hangar filled with towering locomotives, cranes, and decades of railroad grime. The size of the space made the persistent, subtle hum of the active phase 2 timer feel insignificant, yet deeply unsettling. This entire building is an acoustic amplifier, Jenkins observed, her voice swallowed by the cavernous space. Every piece of steel is a conductor. Thorne held up the brass tuning fork. Hayes wrote that the harmonic needs to reach the source of the initial resonance, the great steel conduit. We need to find a specific point that vibrates at the same frequency as this fork. Thorne struck the brass fork against his heel. It let out a high, clear, unwavering pitch, a frequency that was almost painful in its purity. As the tone resonated through the massive depot, they began walking, watching for visual evidence of its effect. Most of the old rolling stock remained silent, but as they passed a towering, decommissioned steam locomotive, one of the oldest in the yard, its brass fittings polished despite its age, the air around it shimmered. The dust motes on its enormous steel boiler began to vibrate violently, creating a visible, localized string pattern in the air. The locomotive was a relic of the 1940s, named the resonator. That's it, Jenkins. The original drum that pounds a city's pulse. Thorne breathed. He approached the resonator and quickly located a small, circular panel, a recently welded steel hatch near the boiler's firebox. The key from Hayes' bunker fit the lock perfectly. Thorne pulled the hatch open. Inside, nestled amidst the dusty pipes and gauges, was a secondary, highly sophisticated electronic console. It was wired directly into the locomotive steel frame, using the immense mass of the train as a giant, citywide antenna. The console displayed the decreasing timer, T-11:47:02. Next to the main switch, Thorne found a heavily bound leather ledger. He flipped it open. The pages were filled with Sebastian Hayes' neat, chilling handwriting. It was an operational log of the 5 tests, including Finch, detailing the success of the temporal harmonic and the acoustic feedback collected. The final page, however, was not written by Hayes. It was typed clinical and addressed to an unseen. Recipient: Operation Silas Protocol, complete. Subject: Hayes served his purpose in refining the temporal harmonic. The resonance is stable. Initiating Phase 2 global broadcast from source. The city of Blackwood is the first chord. Prepare for the full symphony. Signed, the conductor. The conductor, not Hayes. Hayes was merely a high-low technician and a test subject. S. Thorne finished reading. A faint, high-pitched whine started emanating from the locomotive's colossal steel frame, the initial charging sound of the Phase 2 broadcast. We have to shut it down now, Jenkins urged, grabbing a fire axe from a nearby wall, ready to smash the console. No, Jenkins. If we damage it violently, we risk a feedback loop that could kill everyone in this building instantly. Thorne yelled over growing whine. We need to break the source connection. Find the power feed. But as they scanned the console for a main breaker, the speaker on the panel crackled to life. A voice, calm, resonant, and utterly devoid of emotion, filled the hangar. Detective Thorne, your diligence is admirable, but you're only moments away from becoming part of the experiment yourself. You see, the temporal harmonic isn't about fear, it's about control, and your key is merely a trigger. The speaker paused, then delivered the final, crippling blow. You just activated the final failsafe. The key doesn't turn off the system. It locks phase 2 to the specific frequency of the brass tuning fork you used. The string is now tuned to the sound of your own heartbeat, Detective. And I, the conductor, will play you like a finely tuned instrument. The voice, the conductor's, was deep and modulated, carrying an eerie authority that seemed to effortlessly control the vast silence of the depot. The high-pitched whine from the locomotive, the resonator, intensified, now vibrating at the exact frequency of the brass tuning fork. Thorne could feel in his bones, a sharp, unpleasant internal resonance. The conductor knew I had the key and the tuning fork. Thorne realized, his mind racing to overcome the new, terrifying variable. This entire path, the house, the bunker, the key, was a trap designed to tune the harmonic to the frequency of the police investigation itself. He snatched up the leather ledger and frantically flipped to the typed final page, searching for any detail about the global broadcast or the symphony. Jenkins, find the main power coupling connecting this console to the locomotive's frame. We have to physically cut the resonator out of the circuit before that counter hits 0. Thorne ordered S. Jenkins scan the intricate wiring. The voice returned over the speaker, closer this time, almost conversational. You're looking for the off switch, Detective? Such a blunt approach. The temporal harmonic is not a bomb you can defuse. It is an acoustic ecosystem. And now that it is calibrated to the unique acoustic signature of Detective Elias Thorne, the broadcast will amplify your internal state. Suddenly, the pressure in Thorne's head returned, far worse than before. This time, it was accompanied by a terrifying auditory hallucination, the sound of a distant, high-speed train rushing towards him, followed by a faint, ghostly scream. He staggered back, clutching his head. Jenkins, my ears. It's amplify your fear, Detective. Jenkins shouted, her voice strained. It's using the frequency of your own brain waves. Whatever you're afraid of, the conductor is making you hear it. Thorne fought back the rising panic. He knew his greatest fear. The recurring nightmares of a failed rescue operation years ago. The crash, the sound of the grinding metal. The conductor was using that psychic echo to break him. He slammed his fist against the console, trying to clear his head. He had to think of the physics, not the fear. The tuning fork. The frequency has to be precise. Thorne wheezed, shaking off the hallucinations. The conductor needs constant, flawless feedback from the source, from me, to maintain the broadcast lock. He looked down at the brass tuning fork, still clutched in his hand. If it was the frequency source, destroying it might break the lock, but it could also destabilize the entire system, leading to the lethal feedback loop they were trying to avoid. Jenkins, focus on the power cable. I have an idea. Jenkins located a thick, armored conduit running from the console to the locomotive's wheel housing. She raised a fire axe, ready to strike. But before she could bring it down, the conductor's voice cut in, sharp and commanding. Don't. The moment that connection is severed, the resonance will default to the highest stored energy frequency, and your partner will be the first to experience the full force of the harmonic. The threat was clear. The conductor was monitoring their location, possibly through the very sonic vibrations of the building. Thorne realized the only solution was to introduce a competing, overwhelming frequency, one that wasn't deadly, but would drown out his own subtle bioacoustic signal. He needed an acoustic countermeasure. He pointed to the towering, dormant steam locomotive, the resonator. The whistle, Jenkins. Can you access the emergency steam release and blow the locomotive's whistle? It hasn't been used in years, Detective. The valves could be seized. And the pressure. It doesn't matter. A massive, sustained sound wave is the only thing that can override the temporal harmonic lock without destroying the entire device. I need that brass tuning fork drowned out. Thorne held the tuning fork up, the internal resonance making his heart pound a painful, irregular rhythm. He knew that the moment Jenkins succeeded, the conductor would know they were on to his counter dash plan. A.S. Jenkins scrambled up the side ladder of the towering locomotive toward the ancient whistle valve. Thorne picked up the micro-recorder Hayes had used, now lying discarded on the console. He looked directly at the console's built-in camera lens, his expression hard, devoid of the fear the conductor wanted to see. You like a concert, conductor? Thorne challenged, speaking directly into the defunct microphone. Then listen to this. This is the sound of an investigation that just found the source. He pressed play on the micro recorder. The small speaker immediately filled a massive depot with the clear, looping sound of the 5 mechanical clicks of the music box, the temporal boundary, the preset stop signal. The moment the clicks resonated, the complex console inside the locomotive went dark. The countdown timer froze. The resonant, painful whine that had been driving Thorne to the brink ceased instantly. It wasn't a stop signal, Detective. The conductor's voice boomed back, laced with a chilling realization. It was the key to the final sequence. You just handed me the final chord for my symphony. The silence that followed the 5 clicks was heavier than any acoustic void Thorne had ever experienced. The main console inside the locomotive was dark, but the silence wasn't restful. It was pregnant with impending disaster. What did I do? Thorne demanded, his voice echoing in the vast depot. The conductor's voice, now broadcast clearly through every speaker system in the massive Iron Gate depot, was triumphant. You have set the stage, Detective. The 5 clicks were the temporal key that unlocks the full potential of the Silas research, the resonance cascade. Phase 2 was merely an infrasound broadcast. The cascade is a multi-frequency wave designed to synchronize the acoustic signatures of every life form in its radius, turning collective fear into a destructive, palpable force. On the dormant console, a new set of lights began to flicker on. Not green or red, but a deep, vibrating violet. The lights were tracing a complex geometric pattern across a newly illuminated screen, a pattern Thorne recognized instantly from a diagram in Hayes's ledger, the schematic for the temporal harmonic array. The resonance cascade will turn the city's collective anxiety into a single, massive sonic boom. It won't be silent, Detective. It will be the loudest, most terrifying sound ever recorded. The conductor promised. Jenkins, still perched precariously on a ladder near the locomotive's whistle, shouted down, "Detective, the power is rerouting. The entire depot is feeding energy into this locomotive. We have maybe 5 minutes before the cascade reaches critical mass." Thorne knew he had only one chance. The whistle, the tremendous, unshielded noise from the massive steam whistle, was the only known acoustic force capable of disrupting the delicate frequency lock. Jenkins, forget the power cable. Blow the whistle now. Override the system with pure noise. Jenkins braced herself against the rail car. She yanked hard on the ancient, corroded whistle valve. It groaned in protest. Nothing happened. She pulled again, with all her strength. Meanwhile, the voice of the conductor changed pitch, becoming sharper, closer, as if the speaker had moved into the depot itself. "I am done with Blackwood, Thorne. You can stop the whistle, but you cannot stop the cascade. Look at the ledger. Look at the coordinates." Thorne frantically scanned the final page of Hayes's ledger, finding a set of precise GPS coordinates written in small, elegant script, located hundreds of miles away. 40.7128 degrees north, 74.0060 degrees west. New York City, Thorne whispered, recognizing the coordinates for Manhattan. The conductor isn't just killing Blackwood, Jenkins. This resonance cascade is a preliminary test for a global event. He's transmitting the full harmonic to a larger array in New York. Suddenly, the depot's emergency lights flashed on, bathing the interior in a sickly yellow glare. A figure stood silhouetted in the open doorway, a man in a crisp black suit, holding a small, metallic briefcase. He was tall, mid-40s, and wore an unsettling, calm smile. "The conductor," Thorne stated, raising his weapon. The man merely nodded, holding up the briefcase. "The final piece of the stretched string, Detective. It contains the primary transmission array. And since I'm here, I can ensure the full acoustic synchronization is achieved. You failed to stop Hayes. You will fail to stop me." He pressed a button on the briefcase. Instantly, the entire steel frame of the resonator began to scream. It wasn't the steam whistle. It was the steel itself, resonating at a frequency that felt like hot wires being dragged across Thorne's auditory nerves. The resonance cascade had achieved initial synchronization. Thorne dropped to his knees, his hands clamped over his ears, blood starting to trickle from his left ear canal. "Jenkins," he choked out, "now!" With one final desperate heave, Jenkins forced the whistle valve open. With a deafening metallic shriek that ripped through the frequency lock, the massive steam whistle of the resonator erupted. It was a physical wall of sound, raw, unshielded, and overwhelming. The sound hit the conductor like a physical blow, staggering him. The transmission briefcase fell from his hand and slid across the concrete floor. Thorne forced himself up, ignoring the agonizing pain and the overwhelming sound. He sprinted toward the briefcase, his target no longer the man, but the global transmission device. The conductor recovered quickly. He lunged, tackling Thorne just as he reached the briefcase. They slammed against the cold steel of the locomotive. The symphony must be heard. The conductor roared over the shrieking whistle. Thorne struggled, momentarily losing his tactical light. He felt the conductor's cold, strong hands wrap around his throat, tightening with lethal intent. But then, Thorne remembered the brass tuning fork. He pulled it from his pocket and drove the blunt end deep into the conductor's forearm, directly over a prominent vein. The conductor shrieked, not from pain, but from a sudden, jarring frequency injection. The tuning fork, vibrating against his biological system, was the exact antidote to the highly tuned acoustic synchronization he controlled. The conductor stumbled back, holding his arm, his eyes wide and panicked. The whistle shrieked on, drowning out everything. Thorne scrambled to the briefcase. He ripped it open and saw the delicate, networked array of crystals and wiring. He didn't hesitate. He brought his foot down with all his force, smashing the global transmission source into fragments. The instant the array was destroyed, the locomotive whistle sputtered, coughed, and fell silent. The silence this time was clean, vast, and absolute. The conductor looked from the smashed briefcase to Thorne, his face a mask of silent, profound hatred. The vast Iron Gate depot descended into a ringing, shocked silence. The only sounds were the heavy, ragged breathing of Thorne and Jenkins, and a faint metallic drip of condensation. The conductor stood 10 feet away, his black suit rumpled, his face contorted by the pain of the tuning fork's acoustic shock. Thorne recovered his weapon, leveling it at the man in the black suit. "It's over, conductor. Drop to your knees." The conductor remained standing, his eyes fixed not on Thorne, but on the smashed remains of the transmission array. A slow, chilling smile returned to his face, one that suggested contempt rather than surrender. Over? Detective. This was merely the prelude. The conductor sneered. The harmonic is still integrated into the city's acoustic grid. You simply delayed the inevitable. Who are you? Thorne demanded, ignoring the empty threat. Hayes was your puppet. Who is signing, conductor? The man chuckled, a deep, hollow sound. He lifted his hand to his lapel, where a small, silver pin was affixed. It was a stylized tuning fork with a single, dark jewel at its base. "My name," he began, his voice dropping, "is Dr. Julian Silas. I am the grandson of Alistair Silas, and the only true heir to the temporal harmonic." Thorne felt a cold shock. "Silas? Your grandfather and family disappeared in 1941. A lie, detective. A necessary fabrication." Julian Silas corrected, his arrogance absolute. "Alistair didn't disappear. He went into seclusion with his family, my father, as a boy, to continue the research away from the pressures of the military-industrial complex. Hayes stayed on as a visible subject, the test dummy, while we perfected the true goal, acoustic purification." Julian Silas stepped forward, slowly raising his empty hands. "My family spent 70 years in self-imposed exile, living without modern acoustic interference, mastering the concept of the 0 point. Hayes was only given the rudimentary infrasound. I was given the full symphony." Jenkins, finally regaining her balance, aimed her weapon at Julian Silas. "You murdered Finch and 4 others to calibrate this device. They were necessary frequencies. Officer, discordant notes in my symphony." Julian Silas said dismissively. Finch was getting too close to the Iron Gate. He had to be silenced in a way that would lead the police, the acoustic authorities, right into my final trap. Thorne remembered the circular incision on Hayes' arm, the monitoring chip. You were using your own grandfather's student as an elaborate guinea pig. Hayes was a relic, useful for the first phase, but disposable for the cascade. I extracted the final data from his chip before activating the 5 clicks. The ultimate temporal key, Julian Silas confirmed, his tone chillingly clinical. Thorne realized the terrifying scope of the plan. Julian Silas had spent his entire life building the perfect weapon control, using his family's fabricated disappearance as the cover story and his grandfather's loyal apprentice as the bait. "You're under arrest, Dr. Silas," Thorne stated, clicking the safety off his weapon. "Arrest?" Julian Silas laughed, a sharp, humorless bark. "You don't understand. The key to the resonance cascade wasn't the external array you smashed, Detective. It was internal." He pointed to the small, empty socket on the massive, silent console. Hayes's final service was to encode the primary resonance frequency into a small, highly tuned bioresonator, a permanent frequency lock, implanted surgically. Julian Silas smiled slowly, touching the silver tuning fork pin on his lapel. "It's not just a pin, Detective. It is the resonance injector. An implanted bioresonator is inside my own father's chest, the only surviving original Silas, who has lived his life as an acoustic shield." The revelation struck Thorne with paralyzing force. The conductor had the ultimate, horrifying failsafe, a living, breathing power source, his own family. "The clicks, Detective," Julian Silas whispered, his voice regaining its composure. "When you played the 5 clicks into the system, you didn't stop the countdown. You activated the final sequence, the remote activation of the internal bioresonator. My father is now emitting the resonance frequency. I just need to find him." Julian Silas took a final, mocking bow. "Enjoy the silence, Detective. The true symphony is about to begin." Before Thorne or Jenkins could move, Julian Silas slammed his hand down on a nearby emergency brake lever for the decommissioned locomotive. The massive train, the resonator, shuddered violently, and a shower of cold dust and sparks erupted, instantly providing a thick, obscuring curtain of smoke that filled the depot and the ensuing chaos. Jenkins coughed violently. When the smoke cleared a moment later, Julian Silas was gone, having slipped through the maze of steel. Thorne stared at the empty space where Julian Silas had stood, his mind reeling from a horror of a son turning his own father into a living, emitting weapon. The clock was ticking, and the frequency was already being broadcast from an unseen, living source somewhere in the city. Thorne and Jenkins scrambled out of the Iron Gate depot, the air outside feeling miraculously normal after the agonizing cacophony within. Thorne's ears were ringing, and his focus was entirely on the grim task ahead, locating the living source of the temporal harmonic, Julian Silas's father. "Walsh, Julian Silas is a conductor. He just revealed the resonance cascade is broadcasting from a bioresonator surgically implanted in his father's chest. We need to find the father immediately." Thorne shouted into his comms, the brass tuning fork still burning cold in his pocket. "We have to find where he was keeping his father. A safe house, a lab, anything that matches the 0-point criteria." Jenkins added, accessing the files on the Silas family. Within minutes, Sergeant Walsh relayed a critical piece of information. "Thorne, we found a property purchase made by Julian Silas under a shell company 3 months ago. A private, historic crypt in the Blackwood City Cemetery. Highly secluded, shielded walls, registered as a private memorial." "A crypt," Thorne muttered. "A perfect, naturally sound-dampened chamber. The ultimate no-echo house for the final source." Thorne and Jenkins raced to the cemetery. The sky was now a pale, anxious gray, mirroring the city's impending doom. They found the crypt, a massive granite mausoleum nestled deep within the oldest section of the cemetery, its reinforced doors sealed tight. "He's not broadcasting the harmonic for the whole 12 hours. Jenkins, he's waiting for the frequency to hit a critical tipping point. We're running out of time," Thorne said, testing the heavy door. The key from Hayes's bunker, the one Thorne had picked up at the 0 point, fit the crypt's lock. Julian Silas had cleverly made the path of the police investigation the very process of unlocking his entire operation. Thorne kicked the door open. The crypt was small, cool, and utterly silent. In the center, lying on a stone slab, was an elderly man, pale and frail, Julian's father. Wires led from a small, discreet device taped to his chest, the bioresonator, and connected to an antique gramophone horn positioned directly over his heart. Julian Silas stood calmly beside the slab, holding a remote switch and a stethoscope. He was listening intently to his father's chest. A fitting chamber, wouldn't you agree, Detective? Julian said, not even looking up. The sound of death amplified. When the resonance cascade hits the tipping point, his heart's natural frequency will tear the city's acoustic shield apart. Thorne raised his weapon. Turn it off, Silas. Now. Too late, Julian replied, his finger hovering over the remote. The frequency is peaking. But before I end this, I want you to hear what my father hears. Julian Silas pressed a button on the gramophone, directing the sound on the horn towards Thorne. Instead of deafening noise, Thorne heard the slow, deliberate, amplified sound of a human heartbeat. Thump, thump, thump. But the sound was wrong. Each beat contained a rapid, secondary vibration, a frantic rattle of pure, accelerating fear. IT was a resonance frequency, the sound of the dying heart, magnified and weaponized. Thorne knew he couldn't shoot Julian. The bullet might damage the device, or worse, hit the fragile, living resonator, triggering an uncontrolled, catastrophic release of the harmonic. He's your father. Thorne roared, tried to appeal to the last shred of humanity. Julian finally looked up, his eyes cold and empty. He is the final key, the ultimate silent sacrifice for the absolute silence. As Julian prepared to press the final activation switch, Thorne knew the tuning fork was his last chance. The fork's frequency was now intrinsically linked to his own acoustic signature. Thorne gripped the brass tuning fork, struck it hard against the granite floor, and then, with a single desperate motion, he didn't throw it. He plunged the still vibrating brass tines directly into the antique gramophone horn. The vibrating fork, screaming at the frequency of Thorne's own determination, struck the tiny emitter in the gramophone. The effect was instantaneous and violent. A blinding flash of violet light erupted from the gramophone, followed by a thunderous, cracking sound that felt like tearing silk. The competing frequencies, Thorne's acoustic signature battling the heart sphere frequency, created a devastating acoustic overload. Julian Silas screamed, his hands flying to his head as the feedback loop ripped through his senses. The bioresonator on his father's chest short-circuited and fell silent. The crypt was filled with the smell of ozone and burning copper. Thorne staggered back, half-deafened, but alive. When he looked up, Julian Silas was crumpled on the floor, the stethoscope shattered beside him. He was breathing.